Committee on the Judiciary, Subcommittee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any time. I welcome everyone to today's hearing on continuing injustice, the Centennial of the Tulsa Greenwood Race Massacre. Before we continue, I want to remind members that we have established an email address and distribution list dedicated to circulating exhibits, motions, etc. to members who might want to offer them at today's hearing. If you'd like to submit such, Judiciary Docs at mailhouse.gov, and they will be distributed. Finally, I'd like to ask all members and witnesses, both those in person and those appearing remotely, to mute your microphones when you are not speaking. This will help prevent feedback and other technical issues. For those in the room, I'd like to ask you to keep your face mask on at all times unless you're speaking or unless you're over 100 years old. For those in the room, that'll be our protocol. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Mr. Ellis, Ms. Fletcher, welcome and thank you for coming. We appreciate it. Our hearing today serves two primary purposes. First, it is a commemoration of a milestone anniversary, the centenary of the Tulsa Greenwood Race Massacre of 1921, one of the most painful episodes in our nation's long and tortured history of race relations. Sadly, many Americans today are not even aware that this massacre took place, and I hope that this hearing can serve to educate the public about what happened. I myself was not aware, but Chairman John Conyers had a hearing early in my term in Congress, probably about 10, 12 years ago, and edified me and many in Congress. John Conyers needs to be recognized today for his commitment to justice and to the memory of the race massacre and for improvements in Tulsa. The second purpose of this hearing is to highlight many ways that the black community of Tulsa continues to suffer from the effects of the massacre. Indeed, as the hearing's title suggests, the injuries inflicted on the Greenwood community have continued to compound through the succeeding decades since the massacre, often directly because of actions taken by government officials. Over the course of May 31 and June 1 of 1921, a white mob burned to the ground the Greenwood community of Tulsa, one of the most prominent and thriving black communities in the country at the time, often referred to as the Black Wall Street. The white mob, consisting of thousands of people, murdered black residents, looted their property, and burned more than 1,000 homes, churches, schools, and businesses. At least one credible estimate put the number of those killed at 300 people. Recently, the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, visited Tulsa, visited the memorial, and you could see the emotion in him as he toured it. Worse still, that mob, fueled by racial fear and hatred, was aided and abetted by some of the very government officials who were supposed to be protecting the innocent residents and property owners of Greenwood. In other words, the massacre did not simply represent a negligent failure by government authorities to maintain order. Rather, agents of the local and state governments were active participants in the crime. This happened too many places and too many times in our history, but never, I think, as significantly as it did in Tulsa. In the massacre's immediate aftermath, local authorities placed thousands of black residents into internment camps out of fear of what the authorities characterized as a so-called, quote, Negro uprising. Indeed, this narrative of the massacre, a misrepresentation of what happened based on racial fear, was ratified by a grand jury impaneled by Oklahoma's governor after the massacre. That grand jury issued a report less than a month after the massacre that placed the blame for the massacre entirely on the black community. This grand jury also indicted black persons with massacre-related offenses, while no white person was ever held accountable for crimes committed during the massacre. This was 1921 America, 1921 Oklahoma, 1921 when the Ku Klux Klan was again reasserting itself, and the birth of a nation had just been shown a little bit prior to that in the White House. Meanwhile, the Tulsa Massacre resulted in property damage estimated to be anywhere between $25 million and $100 million in today's dollars, representing a tremendous loss of wealth for Tulsa's black community, a loss that was compounded with each succeeding generation. As the descendants of the white mob that looted Greenwood's businesses and homes have had the chance to build on the wealth of their ancestors, including stolen wealth, many black survivors and their descendants have not been able to recoup the wealth that the white mob destroyed or stole during the massacre. In the massacre's immediate aftermath, the city passed a restrictive local ordinance to block rebuilding efforts. While this ordinance was ultimately struck down by the Oklahoma Supreme Court, in the decades since practices like redlining and urban rural policies have prevented black Tulsans from reestablishing a thriving community. Expressways funded by federal governments literally cut through Greenwood, further displacing black families and businesses. A grievance upon a grievance. Looking to the courts for relief, Greenwood's residents were denied justice in the 1920s because of rank racial prejudice, and in the 2000s because of a technical legal hurdle. Meanwhile, the survivors and descendants of the massacre remain without compensation for the harms inflicted on them, and neither the state of Oklahoma nor the city of Tulsa have provided direct compensation to massacre survivors and their descendants. The massacre has exacerbated government actions that over the decades have disproportionately burdened black Tulsans, preventing many from rebuilding their community and regaining stolen wealth. Predictably, this has led to racial disparities and adverse outcomes for the black residents of Tulsa. This is clear from the fact that North Tulsa, which has a higher concentration of black residents, is poorer, has fewer businesses and large-scale employers, has the fewest jobs, has more than double the unemployment rate, and has the lowest life expectancy when compared to the rest of Tulsa. In short, present-day racial and economic disparities in Tulsa can be traced back to the massacre. In America, Tulsa is a microcosm of what has happened to the African-American community in this country. In light of the foregoing facts, Congress needs to step up. Many of our witnesses have called for some form of reparation for the survivors and descendants of the massacre. One potential remedy that I find of particular interest is the idea of a victim compensation fund. This subcommittee has jurisdiction over such compensation funds. For example, last Congress, we held a hearing to permanently reauthorize the 9/11 Victim Compensation Fund, which one of our witnesses suggested as a model for compensating potential Tulsa claimants. I'd be interested in hearing from our witnesses more details as to how such a fund would be structured and funded. As chairman of the subcommittee, I pledge to work with you on legislation on this front. When the subcommittee last held a hearing on this topic back in 2007, we heard from the late distinguished historian John Hope Franklin, author of From Slavery to Freedom, a book I had as a classroom text at Vanderbilt. John Hope Franklin was here, and he was also a survivor of the Tulsa Massacre. He testified about the culture of silence surrounding the massacre among the white community of Tulsa in the years following the massacre, a culture that sought to erase the massacre from historical memory. He also emphasized the importance of confronting and dealing honestly with historical truth. What John Hope Franklin, a historian of eminent success and acclamation, said then is true today. We must deal with historical truth. We must heed Professor Franklin's admonitions, keep the memory of the massacre alive, deal honestly with the truth, and ensure reparations for the century of suffering the survivors and descendants of the massacre have endured. I look forward to hearing our witnesses' testimony today, and I thank them for being with us today. I now yield time to the ranking member, Mr. Johnson, Louisiana, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. First, I want to especially thank our witnesses. I know it took some effort for you to be here, and we deeply appreciate it. Particularly this panel, our first panel of two, because you are survivors of the Greenwood Massacre. And I am going to briefly repeat the history of that again, because as you say, Mr. Chairman, not enough Americans remember this sad chapter. But in 1921, Greenwood was a thriving commercial and residential district in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It was home to the city's African-American residents, as was said, and Greenwood hosted restaurants and churches and grocery stores and entertainment venues, clothing and jewelry stores, the offices of professionals like doctors and lawyers, and it led some to refer to it as the Black Wall Street. Unfortunately, the story of Greenwood is not just one of success, but the other side of that coin is it's a terrible, tragic story of violence and destruction. Between May 31 and June 1 of 1921, as many as 100 to 300 people were estimated to have been killed in the Tulsa Greenwood Race Massacre. Approximately 35 blocks of Greenwood, amounting to more than 1,200 homes and dozens of businesses, were burned, and as many as an additional 400 homes were looted but left standing. This violence was perpetrated by a mob of the city's white residents, and it took place during an era when racial violence was all too common. It's one of our nation's darkest chapters indeed. As I've said many times before, in America, we recognize that each of us is made in God's image, and that every single person has inestimable dignity and value. And our value is not related in any way to the color of our skin, where we're from, what we do for a living, what zip code we live in. All of us are created equally before God, and racism and racial violence violate the most fundamental principles of our great nation and the will of our Creator. While our country has its faults, we've obviously come a long way since the Tulsa Greenwood Race Massacre, and we believe our best days are still ahead of us. While it is important, obviously, that we recognize these terrible events that occurred 100 years ago, we also, at the same time, need to acknowledge that, thankfully, this event is not indicative of the broader reality that is present in our country today. Thank God for that. We must continue to move our country forward, to remain cognizant of the past, because we learn from our history, work to create a unified America that honors the value of every single citizen, regardless of their race, and provides a path of opportunity for those who work hard and seek it. America is a great country, and we are still on our way, as the Constitution's preamble says, to forming a more perfect union. In 1862, President Lincoln famously said, "In giving freedom to the slave, we assure freedom to the free, honorable alike in what we give and what we preserve. We shall nobly save or meanly lose the last best hope of earth." More than a century later, in his Time for Choosing speech, Ronald Reagan echoed that sentiment, and he said it this way, quote, "You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We have a responsibility to preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth," unquote. That remains our great challenge still today. We're working through that, and the testimony that you provide helps us because it gives us context and history and the things that we have to consider as we try to preserve this last best hope of man on the earth. I pray, and all of us do, that we remain faithful in that challenge. I again thank our witnesses for being with us this morning. We really do look forward to your testimony, and I'll tell you, we don't have many centenarians testify before our committees. So this may be, I would suggest we may be making history here today. We're really grateful you're here. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Appreciate Mr. Johnson's comments. And now I recognize the chairman of the full committee, who is, of course, responsible for the actions of this subcommittee as well, Mr. Nadler of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's hearing is an important opportunity to commemorate the Tulsa Greenwood Race Massacre of 1921 and to consider what legal and policy measures might be enacted to compensate the survivors, their descendants, and Tulsa's greater black community. Nearly 100 years ago, in what the late historian John Hope Franklin described as a firestorm of hatred and violence that is perhaps unequaled in the peacetime history of the United States, a white mob looted and destroyed nearly 40 square blocks of Tulsa's Greenwood district, a segregated yet vibrant black enclave whose prosperous businesses made it known across the country as the Black Wall Street. The reportedly 5,000 to 10,000 strong mob destroyed many of those businesses, along with the district's hospitals, churches, and private homes, leaving almost 9,000 Greenwood residents homeless. According to a 2001 report, by an Oklahoma State Commission to study the massacre, one credible contemporary source estimated the death toll of 300 people, far higher than the official record made at the time. The 2001 Commission also found credible contemporary reports of mass burials. In 2018, the city of Tulsa finally began the process of locating these mass graves. It is only within the past year that state archaeologists pinpointed the location of one potential mass gravesite. Authorities are now taking steps to exhume the bodies for identification and reburial. I've said so before, and I'll say it again. The Tulsa Greenwood Massacre can be described as an act of ethnic cleansing, which was subsequently wiped from the history books for many decades, despite having made national news at the time. We are honored to have with us today some of the last remaining survivors of the massacre, and I welcome them. I appreciate the fact that this subcommittee can play a role ensuring that this history is never lost again by hearing directly from those who experienced the tragic injustice that unfolded in Tulsa during the overnight hours of May 31st and June 1st, 1921. In addition to commemorating the massacre's victims, this hearing is also another opportunity to consider the massacre's long-lasting repercussions for the survivors, their descendants, and Tulsa's greater black community, and what role Congress can play in remedying this historic injustice. The 2001 Commission report found significant evidence demonstrating not only that local and state authorities failed their responsibility to maintain civic order, but also that government agents actually aided the mob in carrying out the massacre. Thousands of black residents were interned for days and weeks after the massacre under the justification that it was for their so-called protection. A majority of the 2001 Commission members declared at that time that, quote, reparations to the historic Greenwood community in real and tangible form would be good public policy and do much to repair the emotional and physical scars of this terrible incident in our shared past. It is now 20 years later, and neither the state nor the city of Tulsa has directly compensated survivors or their descendants. Survivors and their descendants have tried to seek legal redress from the city of Tulsa and the state of Oklahoma for massacre-related harms. Unfortunately, these claims have never been decided on the merits. In 2004, a divided 10th Circuit upheld a lower court's decision dismissing Greenwood survivors' claims, holding that the plaintiffs' claims were barred by the applicable statute of limitations and that no equitable tolling to the statute of limitations period applied. In 2007, when I was chair of this subcommittee, we held a hearing on legislation authored by the late former chairman of the full committee, John Conyers, that would have created a new federal cause of action for Tulsa Greenwood Massacre claimants that would permit their case to be decided on the merits. Similar legislation that helps address relevant statutes of limitation issues that have bedeviled these claims in the past certainly remains one potential avenue for survivors and their descendants to obtain compensation. The subcommittee should also examine other proposals for reparations, with particular consideration given to the massacre's contribution to the racial and economic disparities that exist in Tulsa today. I want to commend Chair Cohen for holding today's hearing. I also thank Congressman Hank Johnson for his leadership on the commemoration efforts spearheaded by the Congressional Black Caucus, and Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee for her efforts to secure a House vote on a resolution recognizing the centenary of the massacre. I look forward to hearing from all of today's witnesses, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Nadler, and I, too, appreciate the work of Congresspeople Johnson and Sheila Jackson Lee for their work on this effort as well. I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's hearing, as the previous speakers have indicated, commemorates the 100th anniversary of the massacre that occurred in Tulsa, Oklahoma's Greenwood District in 1921. We are honored to have survivors with us here today, in particular Mr. Van Ellis and Ms. Fletcher. Thank you all for sharing your experiences with us. What happened in Tulsa in 1921 was as wrong can be. And today's hearing is important. It allows us to acknowledge the atrocity that took place in Tulsa in 1921 and learn from that tragedy. This hearing also allows us to reflect on our progress as a nation since the Tulsa Massacre. America, while not perfect, is an exceptional country. America is the best country in the history of the world. We are always growing, always learning, and always striving toward a more perfect union. And this hearing, where we can take stock of what happened in our past and learn from it, shows just how exceptional America really is. In recent years, we have seen the lowest unemployment rate for African Americans in history, historic criminal justice reform, and expanded educational opportunities. As we reflect on the past, we must discuss how we can empower the community affected by this tragic event with improved employment and educational opportunities. I look forward to all the testimony today, but particularly from the survivors of this tragedy from 100 years ago. Thank you again for all being here today, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Jordan. We welcome our witnesses and thank them for participating in today's hearing. I will now remove my mask, and I will introduce each of the witnesses. And after each introduction, we'll recognize the witnesses for his or her oral testimony. Each of your written statements will be entered into the record. We ask you to testify in 5 minutes, but we will understand. To help you stay within that time, there are lights on your table, switches to green to yellow to indicate you have a minute remaining, and when it turns to red, it means your time has 5 minutes have expired, but we will be liberal in the first panel. For our witnesses testifying remotely, there's a timer in the Zoom view that should be visible at the bottom of your screen. I would like to remind all of our witnesses appearing on both panels that you have a legal obligation to provide truthful testimony, and that if you should not, you are subject to prosecution under the United States Code. Today we have 2 witness panels. On the first panel will be a very special group of witnesses, the 3 known remaining survivors of the Tulsa Greenwood Race Massacre. We're deeply honored that they have agreed to testify before us and eagerly anticipate hearing their firsthand accounts of that horrific days. We also know, for those witnesses who traveled to Washington, about your difficulties with your flight and delayed luggage, so we're even more grateful to have you here with us today. There's been an agreement the subcommittee will forego questions of the first panel, and we will simply, unlike most Congresspeople, just listen and learn. Our first witness is Miss Viola Fletcher, also known, if I can, Mother Fletcher. Thank you. I don't have a mother, so thank you. Mother Fletcher is the oldest living survivor of the Tulsa Race Massacre. She was 7 years old when she lived through the massacre. Mother Fletcher, you are now recognized to testify. Is the microphone on?
Yes. My name is that okay. My name is Viola Ford Fletcher. I'm the daughter of Lucinda Ellis and John Wesley Ford of Tulsa, Oklahoma. I'm the sister of Hughes Van Ellis, who is also here today. I'm a survivor of the Tulsa Race Massacre. 2 weeks ago, I celebrated my 107th birthday. Today, I'm visiting Washington, D.C. for the first time in my life. I'm here seeking justice, and I'm asking my country to acknowledge what happened in Tulsa in 1921. On May 31st in 21, I went to bed in my family's home in Greenwood. Neighbors of Tulsa, the neighborhood I felt asleep in that night, was rich, not just in terms of wealth, but in culture, community, heritage, and my family had a beautiful home. We had great neighbors, and I had friends to play with. I felt safe. I had everything a child could need. I had a bright future ahead of me. Greenwood could, still, Greenwood should have given me the chance to truly make it in this country. Within a few hours, all of that was gone. The night of the massacre, I was awakened by my family. My parents and 5 siblings were there. I was told we had to leave, and that was it. I will never forget the violence of the white mob when we left our home. I still see black men being shot, black bodies lying in the street. I still smell smoke and see fire. I still see black businesses being burned. I still hear airplanes flying overhead. I hear the screams. I have lived through the massacre every day. Our country may forget this history, but I cannot. I will not, and other survivors do not, and our descendants do not. When my family was forced to leave Tulsa, I lost my chance of an education. I never finished school past the 4th grade. I have never made much money in my country. State and city took a lot from me. Despite this, I spent time supporting the war effort in the shipyards of California, but most of my life I was a domestic worker serving white families. I never made much money, but to this day I can barely afford my everyday needs. All the while the city of this Tulsa have unjustly used the names and stories of victims like me to enrich myself and its white allies through the 30s million raised by the Tulsa Centennial Commissioner while I was continuing to live in poverty. I am a 107-year-old and have never seen justice. I pray that one day I will. I have been blessed with a long life and have seen the best and the worst of this country. I think about the horror inflicted upon black people in this country every day. This subcontinued committee has the power to lead us down a better path. I'm asking that my country acknowledge what has been happened to me, the traumas and the pain, the loss, and I ask survivors and descendants to be given the chance to seek justice, open the door. All of you know how easy it is to deny that a violent mob threatened your lives and took your property. For 70 years, the city of Tulsa and its Chamber of Commerce told us that the massacre didn't happen, like we didn't see it with our own eyes. You have me here right now. You see Mother Randall, you see my brother, Hughes Van Ellis. We live this history, and we can't ignore it. It's our lives with us. Oh, my goodness. We lost everything that day, our homes, our churches, our newspapers, our theaters, our lives. Greenwood represented all the best of what was possible for black people in America and for all the people. No one cared about us for almost 100 years. We and our history have been forgotten, washed away. This Congress must recognize us and our history. For black America, for the white Americans, and for all Americans, that's some justice. Guess was that it. Thank you.
Do you want to say anything else?
I thought it was another page.
Do you want to say anything else?
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else you want to say?
No, that's not.
Thank you very much. We appreciate very much your testimony. Mother Fletcher, if we don't learn from history, we're doomed to repeat it. So thank you for putting us on the right course to learn and to understand and to do better.
Thank you.
Are you the older of the two siblings?
The older?
Are you older than your brother here?
Yes.
You are?
Yes.
So he's used to having a tough act to follow. Our next witness is Mr. Hughes Van Ellis,
Yep.
known as Uncle Red.
Yep.
He's a World War II veteran, having served in the United States Army in the China-Burma-India Theater of Operations as a member of an all-black unit. He's also a survivor of the Tulsa Race Massacre. Uncle Red, you're on.
Chairman Gorman, Ranking Member Johnson, and member of the subcommittee. My name is Hughes Van Ellis. I am 100 years old, and I am a survivor of the Tulsa Race Massacre. Because of the massacre, my family was driven out of our home. We were left with nothing. We were made refugees in our own county. My childhood was hard, and we didn't have much. We worried what little we worried what little we had would be stolen from us, just like it was stolen in Tulsa. You may have been taught that when something is stolen from you, you can go to the courts to be made whole. You can go to the courts to get justice. This wasn't the case for us. The courts in Oklahoma wouldn't hear us. The federal courts said we were too late. We were made to feel that our struggle was unworthy of justice, that we were less valued than whites, that we weren't fully Americans. We were shown that in the United States, not all men were equal under law. We were shown that when black voices called out for justice, no one cared. But we still had faith things would get better. We still believe in the promise of America in the cases of freedom. I did my duty in World War II. I served in combat in the Far East with the 234th AAA Gun Battalion. We were all black battalion. I fought for freedom aboard, even though it was ripped away from me at home. Even after my home and my community were destroyed. It's because I believe in the end, America would get its right. When I returned home from the war, I didn't find any of this freedom. I was fighting for overseas. Unlike white servicemen, I wasn't entitled to GI Bill benefits because of the color of my skin. I came home to segregation, a separate and unequal America, but still I believed in America. This is why we are still speaking up today. Even at this age of 100, the Tulsa Race Massacre is a footnote in the history books for us. We live with it every day, and the thought of what Greenwood was and what it could have been. We aren't just black and white pictures on a screen. We are flesh and blood. I was there when it happened. I'm still here.
That's right. That's right.
My sister was there with she stood here. We are not asking for a handout. All we are asking for is for a chance to be treated like a first-class citizen who truly in the pictures of the promise that this is a land where there is liberty and justice for all. We are asking for justice for a lifetime of ongoing harm that was caused by the massacre. We can give us the chance to be hard and give us a chance to be made whole. After all of these years and after all of our struggle, I still believe in America. I still believe in the ideas that I fought overseas to defend. And believe if given this chance, I will do the right thing and justice will be served. Please do not let me leave this earth without justice like all the others, massacre survivors. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Do you want to say anything else? You want to say anything else?
I want to say that I appreciate being here, and I hope we all will work together. We are one. We are one.
Thank you, Mr. Van Ellis, AKA Uncle Red. The last witness on our panel is coming to us through Zoom, our reasonable facsimile of such, Miss Leslie Benningfield Randall. Mother Randall was 6 years old when she lived through the Tulsa Race Massacre. Mother Randall will be joining us virtually. Mother Randall, you are recognized now.
Good morning, Chairman Cohen,
Good morning.
Ranking Member Johnson, and members of the subcommittee. I am blessed and honored to be here speaking with you today. It means a lot to me to finally be able to look at you all in the eye and ask you to do the right thing. I have waited so long for justice. My name is Leslie Evelyn Benningfield Randall. People call me Mother Randall. Today I'm 106 years old. 100 years ago, in 1921, I was a 6-year-old child. I was blessed to live with my grandmother in a beautiful black community in Tulsa, Oklahoma, called Greenwood. I was lucky. I had a home and I had toys. I didn't have any fear. I was a young child and I felt very safe. Oh, thank you. My community was beautiful and was filled with happy and successful Black people. Then everything changed. It was like a war. White men with guns came and destroyed my community. We couldn't understand why. What did we do to them? We didn't understand. We were just living, but they came and they destroyed everything. See, let's see. They burned houses and businesses. They just took what they wanted and out of the building. Then they burned the building, burned them. They murdered people. We were told they just dumped the dead bodies into the river. I remember running outside of our house. I just passed dead bodies. It wasn't a pretty sight. I still see it today in my mind 100 years later. I was so scared. I didn't think we could make it out alive. I remember people were running everywhere. We waited for the soldiers to come, and when they finally came, they took us to the background where we would be safe. It felt like so long before they came. Thank you. Let's see. I survived the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, and I have survived 100 years of painful memories and losses. By the grace of God, I am still here. I have survived. I have survived to tell this story. I believe that I am still here to share it with you. Hopefully, now you all will listen to us while we are still here. Some more? The white people who did this to us were filled with so much hate. It is disgusting that they hate us that they hate us for no reason except that we are Black people. We know most of the people who committed these acts and died are dead now. The three of us here today are the only ones left that we know of. But just because these men are probably dead, the city and county of Tulsa, the state of Oklahoma, and the Tulsa Chamber are still responsible for making it right, because it was they who caused the massacre, and it's continued on. The chamber helped ensure that we could not rebuild after the massacre, including holding us in intimate camps. They owe us something. They owe me something. I have lived much of my life poor by opportunities. My opportunities were taken from me, uh, and taken from me and my community. North Tulsa, Black Tulsa is still messed up today. They didn't rebuild it. They sure did. It's empty. It's a ghetto. They have raised more than $30 million and have refused to share any with me or the other two survivors. They have used my name to further their fundraising goals without my permission. Now that's a crime and misrepresenting my support of their upcoming continual yes events focused on making Tulsa look good and not justice. You can help us get some justice. America is still full of examples where people in positions of power, many just like you, have told us to wait. Others have told us it's too late. It seems like justice in America is always so slow or not possible for Black people. And we are made to feel crazy just for asking for things to be made right. There are always so many excuses for why justice is so slow or never happened at all. I am here today, 106 years old, looking at you all in the eye. We've waited 100 years. No, we have waited too long, and I am tired. We are tired. And lastly, I am asking you today to give us some peace. Please give me, my family, and my community some justice. Thank you. Oh.
Thank you, Mother Randall. Thank you, Mother Fletcher and Uncle Red. Your efforts to be here are appreciated. Your testimony is greatly appreciated. As I was affected in 2007 by the testimony of John Hope Franklin, I know my colleagues on the panel and those who are watching will be affected by your testimony. Thank you so much. The subcommittee knows and thanks you for your strength and perseverance in telling these stories for the record and for future generations. We will now take a brief recess for you to be able to leave the committee room with our thanks and our appreciation, and then we'll go to our second panel. Thank you so much. If the second panel witnesses are here, you can assume your places. Thank you so much. Massacre. Representative Goodwin is a Tulsa native and currently serves as chair of the Oklahoma Legislative Black Caucus and is assistant minority floor leader. Representative Goodwin received a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree from the University of Kansas and completed master's coursework at Columbia College in Chicago, Illinois. I understand the Oklahoma House is in session today and that Representative Goodwin might have to briefly step out during points in her hearing to cast votes on the House floor. Thank you for being here, and you are recognized.
Thank you so much. It is, first of all, I'd just like to say it's a privilege to be able, first of all, to hear from Miss Leslie Benningfield Randall at 106, Miss Viola Ford Fletcher, 107, Mr. Hughes Van Ellis, 100 years old. I have the pleasure of knowing these folks and knowing that they indeed are deserving of justice. I will say before I start my statement that I think really for right-hearted, right-minded folks, we've heard enough. It is beyond question that a massacre occurred in 1921. It's beyond question that death happened and murder happened and bombs from airplanes fell on Tulsa. And what holds us up for a century are those that would want us to just say, God bless America. Those that would want us to say that America is the greatest country that we could ever think of. But what we fail to understand is that as we are all American, we're not all treated as the best Americans should be. And I think that we've had a marvelous example of those that have given their lives, that have served this country. And even today, they say perhaps God allowed them to live this long just so they could see this day, to make it for the first time to Washington, D.C. And we hope that the welcome is real And beyond us understanding what happened, we get it. We've been saying it for a long time, but beyond saying it and beyond hearing it, where are the doers of God's word? So we're just saying that beyond the, yeah, we feel sorry for you, you're nice senior citizens, thank you for stopping by, where they stopped by for justice. And I'm just hoping that right hearts and minds will prevail so that the John Hope Franklin that has passed on, who we had the privilege of knowing, he died seeking justice. My great-great-grandfather, James Henry Goodwin, he was in Tulsa. My great-grandmother, Carly Marie Goodwin, she was in Tulsa. My grandfather, Edward Goodwin, and my aunt, Anna Goodwin, all Tulsans, all survivors of the 1921 race massacre. They went to the courthouse, the district courthouse, in 1921. They were not too late. The statute of limitations had not expired. And they went saying that we had property, some 14 properties. We had a building at 123 North Greenwood. My great-grandmother talked of her silverware and her linen, and she talked about her feather mattresses, and she talked about the piano destroyed. She talked about the books in the library gone. And she had the courage when murderers were still walking the streets of Greenwood, when arsonists who thought that they should just light curtains on fire and destroy 35 square blocks. She had the courage in the midst of all of that chaos, all of that mayhem, to say, you took from me what was mine. We worked hard for what we had. We had a tight-knit Black community because segregation would not allow us to interact with our other human beings who just happened to be another color. And we made a great community. And when she went to the courthouse, she was rejected outright. So you can't say the statute of limitations ran out. What you can say what had run out and what we did not have in supply was justice. And then I also think about my grandfather, who was in high school at the time. And he was a senior, just like anybody else who was privileged to get that far in school and to graduate. And he was decorating a hotel at the time and preparing for graduation exercises. And all they heard was that trouble is coming. And how would they have known that trouble is coming meant the worst racist, terrorist attack on American soil in history? How would they have known that the theaters that they would attend and Black-owned, the hotels that they were decorating, right, which would rival any white hotel in terms of its quality, in terms of its grandeur, how would they have known that trouble is coming meant that that community was going to be consumed, first of all, with hatred and then with fire? And that airplanes would fly overhead and drop bombs. It is a history that we as descendants have known all of our lives. And I was blessed to grow up in that Greenwood community. And it's somewhat disturbing to know that that incident that set off that 1921 race massacre was basically a lie. And it was a lie that took lives. It was that same old story about the scary, savage Black man who somehow was harming the white damsel in distress. And we know that was not even the case.
Representative Goodwin, we're going to have to wrap up. Can you wrap up? You're a minute over.
Yes, I will wrap it up. I will say this. Reparations are due. The harm is ongoing. And Tulsa now, when you still have the same ownership as it was in 1921, when the unemployment rate is 2.5 times that of our white counterparts, when criminal justice reform is not happening in Tulsa, those same police, that same state, that same city that was complicit, it exists today. Reparations are due. Restoration is due. Restitution is due. Thank you so much for allowing me to go a bit over time. We've got 3 great examples staring us in the face, crying out for justice. All we have to do is answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Goodwin. And if you see my friend Angela Munson, we served together on the National Conference of State Legislatures many years ago, and I know she's a colleague of yours at one point, I think. Give her my best.
Absolutely. Was just with her last week. Thank you. Will absolutely convey the message.
Thank you.
Thank you for the privilege.
Our next witness is Demario Solomon Simmons. He is the founder and executive director for Greenwood. He's an attorney with a nationwide practice that includes advocating for reparations for the survivors of the 1921 Tulsa Greenwood Massacre and citizenship rights of Black Creek Indians. He's also an adjunct professor at the University of Oklahoma teaching courses on African and African American history, culture, and other issues. He received his JD from the University of Oklahoma College of Law, holds a Master of Education degree and a BA from the University of Oklahoma. And we welcome you, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. In Tulsa, the racial and economic disparities that we see today is a direct result of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. Those are not my words. Those are the words of the current mayor of Tulsa, G.T. Bynum. And these disparities that we all know exist, some of these disparities, if you've already heard, is that we live 11 to 14 years less than our white counterparts in South Tulsa because we have no health care. We have no hospital. North Tulsa, Black Tulsa is where I live, where I grew up. I'm a son of Greenwood, a proud product of North Tulsa. We have no hospital. We're shot and beaten by the police 3 to 4 times more than our white counterparts in Tulsa. We have 35% of our people, Black people in Tulsa, living in poverty. We own our homes 2.5 times less in Tulsa, Blacks, than white Tulsans. We have evidence after statistic after statistic. Yet, our mayor, our city, our county, our chamber, they oppose justice. They oppose reparations. They oppose Mother Randall, Mother Fletcher, and Mr. Ellis, who you heard from today. I am here today because the city of Tulsa has failed us. They bombed us. They burnt us. They killed us. They looted from us. They destroyed not just our property, not just our livelihood and our lives, but our legacy, our generational wealth, the idea of Greenwood, a freedom mind state, land ownership, and wealth concentration. They took that from us. And then they put in a system of policy violence that continues to this very day. So much so that right now, as I speak, the same perpetrators of the massacre, the city, the county, the chamber, the state, are utilizing the massacre to pad their own pockets. They're utilizing the branding of the massacre, the narratives, the names, and the likenesses of people who suffered, who died, who was treated as refugees, who lived in internment camps for 18 months, who had to be signed out by a white person with an ID card. These people who have raised more than $30 million in the name of the massacre for what they call cultural tourism. Not one penny has been given to any of the survivors. Not one dime has been paid for the claims that are still outstanding. The claims that these sophisticated, wealthy Black people had the wherewithal, the savviness to have insurance policies. Over 1,400 claims remain today. Over $50 million. We know who's owed this money. We know who made the claims. We know where they lived. We know what was taken. We also even know some of the insurance companies that are still active today. I want to give you their names. CNA, AIG Companies, the Insurance Company of Pennsylvania, Westchester Fire Insurance Company, the Hartford, Great American Insurance Company, Insurance Company of North America, North River Insurance Company, California Insurance Company, Phoenix Assurance Company. We have reached out to these folks, asking them to engage in a conversation on how they can directly benefit those who they failed 100 years ago. And just like the city has refused, just like the state has refused, just like the chamber has refused, we have not got any of the insurance companies to engage in a meaningful discussion with us at this time. The banks failed us. Thousands of the survivors of Greenwood lost their life savings in the banks because their bank books burnt up and they couldn't get their money out. And we've researched and found at least 17 of those banks we believe are still operating through Chase and Bank of Oklahoma. We want a conversation with them also. The courts failed us. There's been over 100 lawsuits filed on this issue, and not one has been heard on its merits. You heard from my clients. I have the great honor to serve as lead counsel. These three wonderful, amazing people you heard from today. We went through hell to get here. Mother Fletcher traveled yesterday from 6 a.m. in the morning, and we didn't get in to our hotel till after midnight. This woman didn't complain. This woman didn't have anything to eat. She said, I got to be here. I want to see justice. Representative Coyne, Representative Nadler, Representative Jackson Lee, I was here in 2007. I appreciate you still being with us. But as you know, we have lost so many since that hearing. Otis Clark, Dr. Olivia Hooker, John Hope Franklin. And even we've lost my great mentor, Charles Ogletree. He's not gone, but he's not with us. People who have fought. I'm literally standing on the shoulders of so much people who have suffered so long. We are coming to you. I am coming to you in the name of my community, my people, my clients, asking that you do for us what this Congress has done for the Japanese internment victims, what this Congress has done for the 9/11 terrorist victims. We're asking to be treated as full human beings. We're asked to be treated, that it is the belief in America that Dred Scott is not the law of the land, that the black man does have rights that America must respect. And I know my time is getting low, but let me just finish with this. Hal Singer. Show you how powerful this issue is. Hal Singer was a world-renowned musician. He was a Greenwood survivor. He was dying over the last summer, 2020, in France. He moved from America because of racism. He had a stroke. He was blind. He was on hospice, dying. And I felt bad because I was communicating with his family. And I said, you know what, maybe I should stop calling you guys because this time period. His wife admonished me. He said, are you crazy? Until he dies, Hal Singer is going to fight for justice for what happened to his parents and his community. And she sent me a letter that he wrote in 2007. And this is what he said. I've never had a lot of faith in the legal system for black men. That's why I moved to France. And I know we will lose a lot of battles. But we must continue to fight for our rights and our dignity. I am here fighting for the rights and the dignity of Mother Fletcher, Mr. Ellis, Mother Randall, my community, and I'm asking you to help us fight. Grant us legislation that pays restitution, gives us the ability to restore what was lost, so we can rebuild for the next 100 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Solomon Simmons, and appreciate your being here and a continuum from 2007 and remembering Tree. Our next witness is Dr. Tiffany Crutcher. She is the founder and executive director of the Terrence Crutcher Foundation and a descendant of the Tulsa Race Massacre. The foundation's focuses are criminal justice and police reform, providing scholarships to African American students, community youth development, and policy advocacy. Dr. Crutcher's twin brother, Terrence, who was shot by a police officer in 2016 in Tulsa while holding his hands in the air. She has since dedicated herself to transforming a justice system that has long perpetuated injustice dating back to the 1921 massacre. Dr. Crutcher received a BA from Langston University and a clinical doctorate from Alabama State University. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairman Cohen, and to this esteemed subcommittee. Thank you so much for having us. My name is Dr. Tiffany Crutcher, and I am the daughter of Reverend Joey and the late Leanna Crutcher, who recently passed away of COVID-19 in January. And I am the great-granddaughter of Rebecca Brown Crutcher, a survivor of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. And as I sit here today in front of this body, in the very seat of our democracy, I know in my bones that she is here with me in this fight for justice. Reparations is simply making amends for a wrong, and that is what we are asking for today. 100 years ago, my great-grandmother was simply enjoying her life as a successful entrepreneur in Tulsa's Greenwood neighborhood. And she wasn't alone. You see, Greenwood, you couldn't go a block without passing a thriving Black-owned home or business. 10,000 people called this place home. This was Black Wall Street, where people like my great-grandmother Rebecca had found safety and a rare refuge in the grim days of Jim Crow. But this paradise, this vibrant place my great-grandmother helped to build would soon be wiped away in a flood of racial terror, white supremacy, and anti-Black racism. On May 31st and June 1st of 1921, an angry white mob began their murderous rampage across Greenwood, turning the once thriving Black community into an apocalyptic pile of rubble, bones, and bodies. Homes were set ablaze with families trapped inside. Men fired guns and indiscriminately into the street. And for the first time in history, bombs were dropped on American soil. Rebecca Brown Crutcher hopped on the back of a wagon and fled for her life. She was one of the thousands of Black Tulsans forced to flee Greenwood and leave everything behind. Within hours, Black Tulsans, Black resilient Tulsans, and their Black neighbors began to rebuild Greenwood from the ashes, even as insurance companies, state laws, redlining practices, and urban removal would time and again seek to destroy this sacred place. What happened in Tulsa was perpetrated by our city's own government. Former Tulsa Judge William Kellogg said it plainly this week. There was no doubt that white Tulsa officials were largely to blame for the massacre. They not only failed to prevent the bloodshed, but had also deputized white civilians and Klan members who took part in the burning and in the killing. Tulsa's government failed its people. Tulsa's government failed these survivors. Tulsa's government failed Rebecca Brown Crutcher. And now we are here asking our nation's government to see that justice is done in the form of reparations. The vestiges of the massacre are still found in Tulsa's criminal legal system, which has torn my family apart. In 2016, Tulsa police officer Betty Shelby shot and killed my twin brother. Terrence Crutcher is his name. Terrence Crutcher is his name. Police looking for weapons instead found gospel CDs in his car. My 40-year-old brother didn't get a fair chance to live. His children didn't get a fair chance to see another day with their father. For 5 years, I have fought for policing reforms like the very ones that each of you have debated and voted on. Just weeks ago, I was in this very building with the families of George Floyd, Eric Garner, and Botham Jean, asking our legislators to end qualified immunity. Policing reform that could have saved my brother's life, and according to the Human Rights Watch and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, could save the lives of so many others. Black people aren't looking for a handout. We are looking for good legislation that recognizes our humanity. We are looking for justice, because for centuries, injustice has cost our families an unspeakable price. Racial disparities are systemic, and they extend far beyond issues of policing. Compared to white Tulsans, Black people in Tulsa are far more likely to be relegated to poverty and neighborhoods that don't have access to fresh fruit or produce. As we speak, people in North Tulsa, a predominantly Black part of town, are celebrating our first full grocery store in over a decade. The grand opening and the ribbon cutting was just yesterday. I'm having trouble celebrating finding crumbs in a food desert. We shouldn't have to live like this, and we shouldn't have to die like this. If you care about racial justice and racial healing, I am asking you to do two simple things. Support reparations for the survivors and descendants of the Tulsa Race Massacre and bring reparations bill H.R. 40 to an immediate vote, and support ending qualified immunity as a part of any police reform legislation that leaves this House. The nation's government cannot sit on the sidelines as Mother Randall, Mother Fletcher, Uncle Red spend their twilight years fighting for justice 100 years after the massacre. Their health is dwindling as they demand reparations, fighting time and again to convince elected leaders to treat us like we matter. I hope you see your loved ones in them. I hope you look past the division of politics and see our humanity. I hope you see why they're calling for reparations for the generational wealth, loved ones, memories, and opportunities that have been stolen from them, from us. I know most of you believe in justice. All we're asking for in Tulsa and Black communities across the U.S. is for repair, respect, and restitution. If Rebecca Brown Crutcher, Mother Randall, Mother Fletcher, or Uncle Red were a part of your family, would you want the same thing? For them, I implore you to embody our nation's sacred promise of justice for all. And as I close with a quote of the late Ella Baker: "Those who believe in freedom cannot rest, and we will not rest until justice comes." Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Crutcher. I have to ask the next witnesses to try to keep your testimony to 5 minutes. We've been most liberal, but we do have time constraints. Our next witness is Mr. T.W. Shannon. He's the Chief Executive Officer of the Chickasaw Community Bank. He previously served in the Oklahoma House of Representatives, where at the age of 34 he became the youngest Speaker of the Oklahoma House of Representatives, as well as the first African American and first Chickasaw Speaker. Mr. Shannon holds a J.D. from Oklahoma City University and a B.A. from Cameron University, Harvard University Fellow, and Aspen Institute Fellow. Mr. Shannon, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Cohen. Ranking Member Johnson, members of the subcommittee, I appreciate this opportunity to share this testimony regarding the adoption of House Resolution 398, recognizing the forthcoming centennial of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. While I am certainly thankful for the attention the resolution will bring to this reprehensible atrocity, much of the language leads me to suspect that there may be other motives for offering it. In my testimony today, I will express my disappointment that this somber occasion is being diluted by those who seek to further inflame racial divisions and foment animosity toward law enforcement. But first, let me focus on the event House Resolution 398 purports to commemorate. What is known today as the Tulsa Race Massacre occurred 100 years ago, and Americans should know of the brutality and atrocity of that day. History, however uncomfortable, should not be censored, nor in today's terms canceled. History should be taught without political bias and without the intent to make any one group, gender, or ethnicity feel responsible for the sins of their ancestors. I don't speak of American history as someone who is unfamiliar with our country's many struggles. Both of my parents were history teachers, and they grew up in a segregated America, a segregated Oklahoma. My father is a veteran and a retired history teacher. They both had their share of racial discrimination, but rose above it and both became college graduates. I learned not just from textbooks in schools, but from my parents, their desire to educate me on a subject that they deeply loved, Black history. In fact, it was my mother who first taught me about the Tulsa Race Riot, which is what it was called then. The event as described by my mother didn't sound like much of a riot to me, at least not on the part of the Black community living in the Greenwood district. It sounded more like an invasion. Yes, she told me about the atrocities that this subcommittee knows well: the looting and burning, the lynching and killing, the utter destruction of an entire community that left hundreds dead and thousands homeless. She also taught me about the unparalleled prosperity of the Greenwood district. And I can't describe to you how inspired I was by her stories of countless Black-owned businesses, all thriving in their segregated economic bubble as a result and a symbol of modern capitalism. My mother, who grew up an hour away from Greenwood in Muskogee, another town with a thriving black middle class during that time, also celebrated the entrepreneurship that was a byproduct of the strong families of Greenwood. She took great pride in teaching me how the fruits of capitalism took root and blossomed so enormously that the community was termed Black Wall Street. The fact that the black community in Greenwood was so successful really made the destruction all the more painful for me to imagine. All that prosperity, not even a full generation removed from slavery, completely wiped out. Hundreds of families mourning the death of someone they loved. Thousands grieving a lost home or destroyed storefront. Many suffered all of those things all at once. This is the tragedy that should be our focus. Instead, I'm concerned the resolution that was adopted by the majority promises to stoke racial tensions by equating white supremacy with police brutality. It accuses law enforcement of a pattern of violence against black people in the United States and state-sanctioned violence. This language, frankly, lands like a slap in the face to our honorable law enforcement officers and all who support them. As an American who appreciates the sacrifice and service of police officers across this country, I reject the false and divisive rhetoric found in parts of this resolution. Mr. Chairman and members, House Resolution 398 may mark the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre, but it does not honor the victims of that tragic day by seeking to further inflame racial divisions. The memory of those who suffered is not honored by generating animosity toward police officers. The families who grieved loved ones who lost livelihoods, those families are not honored by divisive rhetoric calculated to appease the opponents of law and order. Instead, we honor those who suffered and died and families they left behind by simply telling the truth about what happened. We honor them by educating America about the tragic day. But above all, we can honor them by giving their descendants a land of freedom and opportunity. I can think of no greater way to honor the legacy of Black Wall Street than to foster a new generation of black entrepreneurs and business owners, generating wealth and jobs that lift whole communities out of poverty. But if the legacy of Greenwood teaches us anything, it is that if we want strong communities and a strong nation, it first begins with strong families. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Johnson, and distinguished members, I thank you once again for the opportunity to be here today and offer my testimony on this important topic.
Thank you, Mr. Shannon. As the former speaker, you recognize that time is important. Thank you for your testimony. Mr. Clarence Henderson, who I believe is going to be virtual, is our next witness. He's a national spokesman for the Frederick Douglass Foundation. He was a participant in the sit-in protest at the Woolworth Lunch Counter in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960. He also served on the advisory board for Black Voices for Trump. Mr. Henderson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. It is indeed an honor to be a witness before this subcommittee. And the previous testimony has brought tears to my eyes from Mother Randall, Uncle Red, and Mother Fletcher. The 1921 Tulsa race riot was a dark and horrific time in America's history and should be recognized as such. It was a massacre that is virtually unmatched in the recording of history in America and should be acknowledged and recognized by Congress so that history does not repeat itself. This is one of the great lessons of history that shows us of the past divide of America. It is an American past and not an American present. If we study American history in chronological order, we will see that our progress has not been a straight line. There have been detours. Nevertheless, we see the progress that has been made. We see the ratification of 13th, 14th, 15th, and also the 19th Amendment. If we look further, we see the various civil rights acts that have been implemented to recognize that we should judge people by their character and not the color of their skin. We see laws in place dedicated to self-evident truth that is God ordained that we all are created equal. In every instance where Blacks have prospered and succeeded to the heights of business, academia, politics, and more, it has been accomplished not because government threw money at perceived problems, but because our will to succeed was given the freedom to break down boundaries and remove obstacles. Given the atrocity of the Tulsa Race Massacre, with lives, homes, businesses, and millions of dollars of Black wealth destroyed, as well as mass incarceration, the Trump administration enacted policies that focus on building up the Black community. The conservative policies instituted during the Trump administration, namely the First Step Act, funding for HBCUs, opportunity zones, and $5 billion platinum plan, is diametrically opposed with what occurred in 1921. Such policies led to a free market, options in education, lower taxes, entrepreneurialism, and the freedom to choose one's own path. A true attempt to level the playing field for Black America and restore some wealth that had been destroyed. Unfortunately, like what occurred in Tulsa, some would like to effectively erase from collective memory the strides made to improve the Black community under the previous administration. As Frederick Douglass stated, the life of a nation is secure only while the nation is honest, truthful, and virtuous. When I look at our country today, I see a nation that has chosen to be governed by the rule of law and not the rule of man. The United States is great, not because it's perfect. I don't see systemic racism. I see systemic corruption. Yes, our past involved racial injustices. Yes, racism does exist. Yes, socioeconomic issues plague many of our communities. It is great, however, because the freedom of that all Americans have bestowed onto us by our Constitution, which gives us the ability to improve on our imperfections, to evolve from our past mistakes, and to get as close to true equality in comparison to anywhere else in the world. I hope this resolution is used to recognize a horrific past injustice so it is not repeated and not used as a political tool to promote systemic racism. I hope this resolution is not used as a political tool to cause legal enforcement of the law to cease and desist. I hope this resolution will not be used to politicize every facet of the nation's racial diversity for political gain to further exploit and emotionally cripple the Black community. As a participant in the 1960 Woolworth sit-in movement, I recognize freedom is not free. There's a price to be paid, and it is continuous. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Henderson. Our next witness is Chief Aganwale Amusan. He's the president of the African Ancestral Society, a nonprofit organization based in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He's a descendant of the Tulsa Greenwood Massacre and has been leading activists on behalf of massacre descendants. Chief, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and esteemed body. My name is Chief Aganwale Amushan. I'm the grandson of Raymond Beard Sr. and the grandnephew of Matthew and Mary Beard, all of whom were survivors of the 1921 Tulsa Holocaust Massacre or any other matching descriptor. I was born and raised in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Today, I speak on behalf of those whose remains were dumped carelessly into the Arkansas River by the truckloads, those remains that cracked the concrete from beneath the highway built over them, those remains dumped in mass graves like the one I stood in October of 2020 during the mass grave investigation at Oaklawn Cemetery in Tulsa. As a member of the Mass Graves Oversight Committee, I stood in that trench with 12 coffins we uncovered. I couldn't help but to be drawn to a smaller box, which appeared to be the size of a women's hat box. It triggered the memory of something I had read in the Race Riot Commission report in 2001. I rushed home to look at that document again, and it stated that the remains in the trench were not embalmed and the death certificates were not even signed by a medical examiner, a process undignified in every manner. The document stated that Tulsa County paid Stanley McCune Funeral Home to bury 16 bodies in the city cemetery. The report states that 4 of the 16 bodies placed in the mass grave were badly burned, and one was that of a stillborn baby. When I returned, I looked again at the box in the trench. I walked away and wept for the soul of this child and the mother who would never know the whereabouts of her child, lost both in the womb and in the earth. Our family's journey to Greenwood actually started 139 years ago when my children's 4th great-grandfather named King Blue co-wrote a letter submitted to Congress and the House of Representatives, just as I am doing today. King Blue was the former slave of the Chickasaw tribal leader, Benjamin Colbert. He and other tribal representatives presented a document in 1882 called the Memorial of the Chickasaw Freedmen. The intent of this appeal was to encourage the enforcement of the 1866 treaty that obliges the tribe to carry out the stipulations of the third clause, which states the monies given by the federal government to the tribe requires the tribe to grant freed persons of African descent all the rights, privileges, and immunities, including the right of suffrage. The Chickasaw Nation refused to honor the treaty. So my relatives were nationless for 40 years until 1902, when through an act of Congress, thousands of forgotten enslaved Africans were made citizens of the United States of America. Around that time, my freedmen ancestors and those of my spouse migrated to Tulsa's Greenwood district. Greenwood brought a new sense of self-determination, restored dignity, one that would be short-lived, and the dreamland of Tulsa would become a nightmare. In just a few decades, my ancestors would experience enslavement, false freedom, Jim Crow, and a Holocaust that would be hidden from the pages of history for 100 years. Fast forward, it wasn't until 1997 that I became deeply aware of the Tulsa Holocaust and its implications. However, I remained unaware of my family's involvement until my grandfather became a plaintiff in the reparations suit of 2003. I felt a full range of emotions and unanswered questions. And today I regret that I asked so many questions because I was unaware of the trauma that I was invoking. The long-term implications of the Tulsa Holocaust and urban renewal can physically be seen today. This is not a matter of past trauma. It is concurrent. It is concurrent trauma. The long-term implications, again, of this Holocaust can be seen physically today. The plot to destroy the black township of Greenwood was not a spontaneous act caused by a rumor in an elevator. It was premeditated as well as racially and politically motivated. Many who discover the story of Greenwood cannot believe such a place was built, nor can they believe that this type of terrorism happened on American soil, on domestic soil. The violation of the 14th Amendment was not the result of a crazed mob. This was a city-sanctioned violation. The event resulted in the deprivation of life, liberty, property, without due process of law, as well as the failure to provide equal protection of the law. Greenwood was a cultural, social, and economic incubator, an environment that provided apprenticeship and other high standards. Its economic, political, and social stability. Most importantly, it provided a safe place to finally heal and detox, individually and collectively, from the effects of post-traumatic slave syndrome. According to the 2019 story in the Harvard Gazette, the property damage in today's numbers were estimated to be as high as $200 million. The highest form of devastation was the mental suffering that resulted in high rates of PTSD and other forms of psychological morbidity such as depression, anxiety, and homelessness. Many of those who speak of Greenwood often reference the resilience of Greenwood's inhabitants because they rebuilt much of the district by 1925, and I'm winding down. As remarkable as it is, only an estimated 40% of those original inhabitants actually returned to Greenwood. My grandfather's elder siblings were his caretakers. Both disappeared after the massacre, never to return. Their home and laundry business was burned to ashes. We later discovered that my great-uncle Matthew Beard fled to Los Angeles, where he and his wife changed their first names to conceal their identity. One cannot imagine the trauma of not knowing if a family member is dead or alive. Now I understand why my grandfather always said, "No news is good news." My grandfather would return to Greenwood in the 1940s to see it destroyed again in urban renewal. And this is my last paragraph. In 2003, my grandfather passed away a few months after becoming a plaintiff in the reparations lawsuit filed by Johnny Cochran and Charles Ogletree. According to the Supreme Court, this case would not be heard because the statute of limitations had run out. Today, the same city responsible for the crimes of 1921 are leveraging the suffering of 3 living survivors and their descendants in the name of tourism. When I look my oldest son in the eyes, I wonder if the charred baton of justice will burn in the palms of his hands, or will it be cleansed and cooled in the river of restitution?
Thank you, sir. We appreciate your testimony and your work. Our next witness is Dreesen Heth. She is a research advocate at the U.S. Program of Human Rights Watch. She's an expert on reparations and reparatory justice and has authored reports and publications highlighting victims' rights to seek full and effective reparations. that are proportional to the gravity of the human rights violations at issue, including acts of racial discrimination as dictated by international human rights law. Previously testified before us on H.R. 40 in February. She had received a bachelor's degree from Wesleyan University. Ms. Heath, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
On behalf of Human Rights Watch, it is an honor to be here today. Thank you to Chairman Cohen, Ranking Member Johnson, and the subcommittee for this opportunity to testify at such a critical time in our nation's history, nearly 100 years since the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. I am a Tulsa native, born in Tulsa, just miles down from the historic Greenwood District, where my young parents settled for several years among a loving and nurturing Black community that was still reeling from the white supremacist domestic terrorism that defined their lives forever. Growing up, I would hear stories from my parents describing the stark differences between neighborhoods in North Tulsa versus South Tulsa, the disappearance of Black Wall Street, and the constant fear that came with walking the same streets as the KKK. Black community members shared oral histories with them about the aftermath of the massacre. Many said that they never knew where their neighbors went and never heard from them ever again. I later learned that after the massacre, Tulsa city officials promised full restitution and reparations to Black Tulsans, but instead turned their backs on them and worked to block financial contributions, including medical help, preventing rebuilding efforts, and even ordering Black Tulsans into poor conditions in concentration camps. No one was ever charged with the crime for the violence or compensated for the loss of life and economic devastation. I'd never imagined that what eventually bring me back to Tulsa would be the continuation of the massacre and the degradation of Black life. The research of Human Rights Watch brought me back home, and not because Tulsa's Greenwood District was restored to the prosperous Black economic hub it once was, but because abusive and unchecked police violence, a legacy of slavery and the massacre, stole the lives of Terrence Crutcher, Joshua Harvey, Joshua Barre, and many others. According to our research, police violence in Tulsa occurs in the broader context of poverty, racial inequality, and the deprivation of key human rights. Because of the impacts of destructive anti-Black policies like redlining, urban renewal, and highway construction, Tulsa today remains deeply segregated, and Black neighborhoods are underdeveloped and under-resourced, especially in North Tulsa. Black Tulsans live less than their white counterparts, have higher rates of infant mortality, and lower medians of wealth. Today's historic Greenwood District is just a couple square blocks showing growing signs of gentrification and displacement. So you see, time has not healed all wounds in Tulsa. Over the past 100 years, thousands of survivors and their descendants have died awaiting justice. The legacy of the massacre remains a bloody stain that will continue to define this country until reparations are paid. Under international human rights law, the city of Tulsa and the state of Oklahoma have a responsibility to provide full and effective reparations that is proportional to the gravity of crimes committed, as recommended in our May 2020 report. Reparations must be paid immediately to the 3 known living survivors of the massacre, Mother Randall, Mother Fletcher, and Mr. Van Ellis, to the descendants of massacre victims, and to the broader Black community that has not seen intergenerational wealth and economic opportunity. If we can't fully account for one of the worst incidents of racial violence in the U.S., then who are we as a people, and what does this country actually stand for? The plight of Black Tulsans is not their own will to survive, but the government's unwillingness to fully support their survival. There is a clear call for what's right and what's just, and that call is for comprehensive reparations determined by impacted community members at all levels for which harm has occurred. Tulsa's Black community is not celebrating the centennial of the massacre. They are mourning the loss of their community and the loss of opportunity. By passing H.R. 40, the Commission to Study and Develop Reparations Proposals for African Americans Act, and by administering full remedy at the federal, state, and local level for the Tulsa Race Massacre and its continuing impacts, this country can finally recognize the full humanity of Black Tulsans and avoid perpetuating human suffering indefinitely. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our final witness is Mr. Eric Miller. Mr. Miller is a professor of law and Leo J. O'Brien Fellow of Loyola Law School of Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, where he teaches courses on evidence, criminal procedure, and jurisprudence, written extensively on policing, drug courts, and reparations. He received a Master of Legal Letters from Harvard Law School and a Bachelor of Laws from the University of Edinburgh. He was a law clerk for the Honorable Stephen Reinhardt of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit and the Honorable Myron Thompson of the U.S. District Court for the Middle District of Alabama. Professor Miller, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, we have heard that today's hearing on justice for the Tulsa Massacre is racially divisive. We heard that in 1921. We heard that in 2003 when Professor Ogletree and Johnny Cochran filed a federal lawsuit for the survivors. Now, we heard it in 2020 when Mayor Bynum, the mayor of the city of Tulsa, said he would not support payments to the survivors of the massacre, including Ms. Fletcher, Ms. Randall, and Mr. Van Ellis, who you heard testify today. The victims of the Tulsa Race Massacre and their descendants have still not received a penny from the state of Oklahoma or the city of Tulsa. But even some direct payment is not enough. They need transformational justice to remedy the systemic, ongoing wrongdoing still suffered by the victims, their descendants, and the current residents of the Greenwood and North Tulsa districts of Tulsa, Oklahoma. To provide an appropriate remedy, we must understand the nature and scope of the wrongdoing and its impact on the victims. The massacre not only destroyed the Greenwood community, its infrastructure, and human and social capital, it created a diaspora of people driven from their homes, their families, and their support networks. Here's what the state of Oklahoma said about their role in the massacre in a statute it passed in 2001. Quote, local, municipal, and county officials became participants in the mob that killed, looted, and burned down Greenwood. Quote, local officials attempted to block the rebuilding of the Greenwood Committee. Local officials enforced, quote, a conspiracy of silence that served the dominant interests of the state, which found the riot a public relations nightmare for a community attempting to attract new business. The state, quote, ignored its, quote, responsibilities rather than confront the realities of race relations that allowed one race to put down another race. Again, these are all quotes from the state of Oklahoma. They tell of an Oklahoma that was and still is putting profit over racial justice. But they stop short of accounting for the continuing acts of racial discrimination in the years and decades following the massacre. They also fail to account for the people who fled and could not return, some because they were targeted for violence, some because they could not rebuild, or some simply because of the unbearable psychological trauma of the massacre. This great diaspora of the massacre is owed justice too. Typical reparations remedies include trust funds, a commission to identify the victims and their descendants, some permanent historical record, some form of direct payment to the victims, and college scholarships for the descendants. That's roughly what Congress provided for the victims of Japanese internment. However, the remedies for Tulsa must also address the current acts of the city and the Chamber of Commerce who destroyed social, economic, and cultural institutions and who continue to profit off the victims and survivors by misappropriating the histories and likenesses of the victims and their descendants. Repair requires rebuilding infrastructure in Greenwood and North Tulsa, buying back property, building hospitals and health centers, redirecting the highways that split these communities and families and friends apart, and remediating the environmental harms within these communities in Tulsa. These are the engines of its economic, but also its social and human capital. Repair also requires addressing the trauma and hurt experienced by the diaspora of descendants that exists around the country and around the world. The lead plaintiff in the 2003 federal case, which I was proud to be part of, John Melvin Alexander, a World War II and Korean War veteran, said that, quote, the white person can't realize what they've done to the black people here, end quote. The enduring trauma of the massacre marked the survivors and their descendants, and still does, as you heard from so many people to this day. We need a remedy fit for this massive act of horror. We've come here to Congress to ask you to pass it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Miller. We'll now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions. And I'll begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Mr. What? I know is Mr. Sullivan, are you available for questions? Is he here? Well, let me start with Mr. Miller then. I'd like to have Mr. Sullivan for a question. But Professor Miller, some argue that the harms are in the past, that most of the victims and perpetrators are dead, which is all true, and there's no party responsible for the harm, nor any party entitled to receive compensation for the attack. What is your response?
Well, my response is that we can still see the ongoing harms of the Tulsa Race Massacre to this day. Remember, all the families lost all their property in the massacre. They couldn't get their money returned by going to the courts. They couldn't get their money for their property by going to insurance companies. And so it was a devastating financial loss for over 10,000 people in Tulsa, Oklahoma. People fled the city. Families were split apart. And so infrastructure was destroyed. And that sort of destruction has continued over time as the city tried to rezone Greenwood, tried to prevent building back. And when people did build back, the city continued to target Greenwood for racially divisive urban development, driving a freeway through the middle of the community, splitting the community apart, dividing it from the rest of Tulsa. So the acts of the city, of the Chamber of Commerce, of the state, of the county, have continued from 1921 to 2021 to target this community.
So it's been a continuing problem, and there's been no efforts at any remediation. Is that correct?
That's correct. Worse, they've made it worse.
And let me ask you this. One of the witnesses, I believe it was Mr. Simmons, said that insurance companies had not honored claims. How did they go about? These were property casualty insurance, homeowners insurance, whatever. How did they go not get compensation? How did the insurance companies get out of it?
They said there was a riot clause in the insurance and refused to pay up. And so the insurance companies denied hundreds of people their claims, people who are victims of the race massacre, by claiming that they didn't have to pay because of a riot.
Mr. Solomon Simmons, Professor Miller has explained that some of the insurance companies, because of a riot clause, were allowed not to have to compensate the victims. Did the riot clause suggest that they were responsible for the damage? How did that riot clause get interpreted that way and not give them compensation?
First of all, it was the city and the county and the chamber who falsely called it a riot for the express purpose to make it more difficult for the black citizens to rebuild. We have to understand this was not just some isolated event. They wanted their land. They wanted the land of the African Americans because it was very valuable land. And our belief and our understanding of our research that these insurance companies, they didn't do their due diligence. They didn't come down and do an actual investigation. They just took the false narrative that the city and the county and the chamber provided and said, that's good for us. We don't have to pay anything. And we have these particular claims. Happy to give this to your office, Representative Cohen, listing of each claim made, the specificity, and who they made it to.
Thank you. We had a similar situation in Memphis. There was after the Civil War, they called it a riot for the longest time, and of course it was a massacre. And the city was involved as well, in the police and perpetrating it. In Oklahoma, as I understand it, the police, the law enforcement, participated in the massacre. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. It's the same spirit that runs from 1921 to 2021. This is my client right here. I represent the Crutcher family who has suffered from police violence. Her brother was shot with his hands up in the air. So I take great exception to what Mr. Shannon had to say about being divisive. We suffer in Tulsa. I don't know. He's not from Tulsa. I'm from Tulsa. Tiffany's from Tulsa. Chief's from Tulsa. Dreesen's from Tulsa. We suffer at the hands of the Tulsa police. You also heard the name of Joshua Harvey. It's another client of mine, a young man that was tased 27 times to death by the Tulsa Police Department, and none of the officers were disciplined. Betty Shelby was not disciplined for shooting her brother. None of the officers who had witnesses leave the scene on video violated multiple policies. Not one of those officers are disciplined. And you know what? After the massacre, in our papers, they said for this to never happen again, and this being the rise of quote-unquote nigger town, we need to aggressively police these niggas to make sure that they don't rise again. That is what we deal with here in Tulsa. That is the over-policing in my neighborhood, North Tulsa, 36th Street North.
My time has expired, but thank you. We'll try to get back, and now we'll recognize Mr. Johnson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Speaker Shannon, you obviously had a historic rise and very successful career in the state, and we acknowledge that. And I was struck by your testimony. You testified in part that you were inspired by the pre-massacre success of Greenwood, the stories that your parents told you, the history teachers that were in your house, because it represented an American success story where, despite facing horrific racism and other aspects of their lives, Tulsa's African-American residents could flourish economically and socially and culturally. And you noted that that story can still inspire young people today. So the question is, what are some ways that we can emphasize great stories like that to build up and strengthen individuals and communities?
Thank you, Ranking Member Johnson, for the question. As a former resident of Tulsa, I think when we think about the narrative that we tell ourselves, I'm always concerned with this narrative of telling people that look like me that they can't succeed in this country, because it's just not true. This country is a land of systemic opportunity. It is not a land of systemic racism. This country has afforded many people from many different backgrounds great opportunities. Now, that doesn't negate that we've had our challenges, and many of them have been at the hands of people that look like me, and many of them have been victims. People that look like me have been victims at the hands of these crimes, much like the Tulsa Race Massacre, and it is a shame. So we've certainly had our challenges. But when we think about what Greenwood means to the nation and how it inspires people, it is that the idea of capitalism still works. The idea that if we really want to move people out of generational poverty, which is what we're talking about, there are steps to do that. Number one, it starts with finishing school. Whatever school you're in, do the best you can and finish it. The second one is getting married and staying married. We know that those things work, that moves people out of generational poverty. The third thing is to to get a job and keep a job. That's the third thing. Number four is to invest and save. And number five is to give back to your local community. That's how you move people out of generational poverty. And that's exactly what the brave men and women of Greenwood did in many instances with their entrepreneurship, and they continue to inspire people from generations. I was moved by the testimony of Uncle Red and the other survivors and his sister. I think we all can learn a great deal about their courage.
Very good. I wish I could unpack so much of that, but we have so much limited time. Let me go to Mr. Henderson if I can, if he's still on video. Mr. Henderson, you still with us?
Yes.
Great. Just real quick question for you. In recent years, it has become popular for a lot of people to argue that America is a country of systemic racism rather than systemic opportunity, as Mr. Shannon just said. But you testified also that that's not what you see. Could you expound on that a bit further? How would you describe our present situation?
Well, when you look at America, you have to compare it with other countries. America is a country that has fought to free slaves. America is a country that seeks to live out the second sentence in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. And the governments are instituted among men deriving the just powers from the consent of the governed. So it is we, the private citizens, that determine how this country will move forward. And we need to recognize that elections matter and understand the system that we live under. We keep going to another race of people asking permission. When you look at the free market capitalist system, you don't have to ask permission. You can actually fail your way to success. When you look at Thomas Edison, when you look at Booker T. Washington, that failed so many times, but got knocked down, but would not give up. So America's a great country if we look at it from the right direction. All it offers is a great opportunity. We need to take advantage of it.
And how do you think that we can better educate this current generation of Americans about those principles? I mean, does it come down to public school curricula? Does it come down to community education? I mean, does everybody have a role in that? How do you explain that to others?
Everyone has a role in that. We need to go back to classical education, where we teach people how to think as opposed to what to think. Our education system has moved from education to actually indoctrination. And we need to understand the whole total history of this country, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and understand that America is not where it was before, that we all play a part in it, but we need to know the true history of America. If you are a citizen in America and you don't know the history of America, you're a citizen in name only. And for those of us that have cut our teeth on the true grit of courage required for freedom's sake, we need to reach back and share with those that this is your country. You should defend this country when it's right, and stand up against the wrongs that occur.
Thank you. I'm out of time. I yield back. Thanks all the witnesses for being here today.
Thank you, sir. We're going to go out of order because Ms. Sheila Jackson Lee is going to be Speaker Pro Tem. She has to get to the floor. Representative Sheila Jackson Lee, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, let me thank you and the ranking member for the courage to hold this hearing and to present a forum in the United States House of Representatives for these humble souls. Let me quote William Faulkner, because he does not look like me, and Mr. Counselor, he doesn't look like you, and he said, "The past is never dead. It's not even the past." And so to my friends that are here who have given an alternative history, that past never ends. That past is redlining that did not allow investment in black communities. That past is, as the outstanding members of this holy and iconic group, Mr. Hugh Van Ellis, Miss Viola Fletcher, Mother Fletcher, Miss Randall, has said they lived the past. They were not able to get the GI Bill. Miss Randall remained a domestic. She didn't finish beyond the 4th grade. That is the existing and continuing disparities. Let me, for those who may never have seen the vibrance of Greenwood and Tulsa and these young women with their cowboy hats on, living the dream, if you will, way back in 1921, that was Tulsa. That was the economy of this nation embedded in that. And I would just simply say to my good friend who did not read the resolution that we're so proud to have passed, honoring the 100 years, it says, by calling upon all Americans to celebrate the ethnic, racial, and religious diversity that has made the United States the leader of the community of nations and the beacon of hope and inspiration to oppressed people everywhere. That's in HRES 398. That's Tulsa. But let me tell you what else is Tulsa. If you can't make it out, this is a Negro's body with smoke coming out of it, as occurred in 1921, when 300 were thrown in a mass grave, unnamed to this day, and as well held in detention. I'm so glad that our friends in the Japanese American community are in fact supporting H.R. 40. Let me show you that they actually had thriving businesses. That's Greenwood going up in smoke because of an incident in an elevator that has never been able to be defended or accurate. So let me give these questions quickly in the short time that I have for you to be reminded of this. Let me get to Counselor and Ms. Clutcher. Counselor, my time is brief. Emphasize again, which most Americans would understand. The banks had my money, had their money. I remember those little books. We grew up on those little books. You go to the bank, you put the money in, and they mark in your little book that you had money. Tell me two things. You have not been able to get the money out of the bank, and the insurance companies, of which all of us are told to get flood insurance, to get home insurance, that you were not able to get. That's your questions. My time is 1:54. Ms. Clutcher, I've never heard you condemn law enforcement. I have heard you say in the name of your deceased mom and your family and the children of your brother that he was killed in cold blood with his hands up. I want you to respond to that as to what we need to do legislatively to be able to address this injustice. Mr. Counselor.
First of all, Representative Lee, thank you for your leadership on H.R. 40 and in our community. Yes, Dr. Olivia Hooker, who was the first African-American female in the Coast Guard from Tulsa, she talked about this before she passed, and many other survivors. They couldn't get their money out of the banks because the bank said, well, hey, where's your bank book? They said it burnt up. It said, too bad. And so we're trying to have a discussion with these banks to say, let's do a forensic audit and let's go in there and find out what money may still be available to these descendants. And secondly, yes, again, the insurance companies, these black people in Tulsa were very sophisticated. They were business-minded. They were savvy. They had policies, insurance policies, and to this day, no policy actually paid anything that was fair market value and is still owed as we speak.
Thank you. Ms. Clutcher, if you would.
Yes, ma'am. I back police officers. My uncle is a police officer. My father served this country. He was a Vietnam veteran, and so I've never bashed the police, but there is an oath that our law enforcement in this country that they swear to, and I believe in that oath because it simply says, and you all should read it, we are here to protect and serve. My issue is that there are police officers in this country that act antithetical to that oath that they swear to. And so what we're trying to do and what we need for Congress to do is act and pass not a dumped down or a watered down or a half-baked bill, but we need it to, we need to end the doctrine of qualified immunity. That doctrine has hurt my family. There's been a civil lawsuit sitting on a judge's desk since 2017. We've had no closure. My mom went to her grave not seeing justice for her son. And so there are policies in place that allow police officers to get away with legal murder, and we need to make sure that we pass that.
Thank you. My time has run out. I just want to put into the record this statement from the Tulsa Race Massacre that indicated in 2001 damages were up to $100 million. Today in 2021, it may be $200 million. And my commitment to you is to find justice and relief and to demand that the mayor of the city of Tulsa give you the resources to those descendants, not for his pocket, not for the city of Tulsa, but to be able to get those raised monies. Mr. Mayor, hear me now. In the rightful hands of those descendants that are here today and those descendants of those who have died. It is now, the time is now. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your courtesy.
Thank you, Representative Lee.
Thank you. Ms. Ross, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Cohn and Ranking Member Johnson, for holding this extraordinary and important hearing. Hopefully, it will not be the last of these hearings, though hopefully we won't have these kinds of atrocities going forward. I also want to thank all of the witnesses for joining us today. While plenty can change in 100 years, the powerful testimony we've heard today reminds us that history also is alive. The Tulsa Race Massacre lives on through Mr. Van Ellis, Mother Fletcher, and Mother Randall, and their descendants. And thank you, Dr. Crutcher, for being here. It also lives on through the families that lost their homes, their wealth, their loved ones, and the futures that they thought they would have. For those who do not believe that racism exists in the United States, I hope the testimony of our witnesses helped them understand that racism and brutality 100 years ago, 400 years ago, continues to stand in the way of the success of the people here today. Tulsa is not the only city where violent white supremacy has set our nation back. In my state of North Carolina, white supremacists carried out a massacre and a coup d'etat in 1898, toppling the multiracial government in the majority black city of Wilmington. Like Tulsa, Wilmington was once the home to a thriving black community. White supremacists were able to demolish black homes and businesses, kill black civilians, and overthrow a democratically elected government because the system of power in our nation and our state did not intervene. My first question is for Mr. Solomon Simmons about the aftermath of the massacre. It's a dramatic example of how racism, both in the form of violence but also discrimination in government policy, has contributed to the wealth gap between white and black households in present-day America. How did the massacre and its aftermath impact survivors and their descendants' ability to build and pass on generational wealth?
Thank you, Representative Ross, for that question. In many ways, it was impacted. First of all, for up to the 40s and the 50s, for those individuals in Greenwood who survived the massacre and were not run out as refugees, they were severely neglected by the city of Tulsa. They didn't receive any type of city services. They didn't have paved streets. They didn't even have proper plumbing so they can have running water in their homes. And then they brought in urban renewal, which we call in Tulsa Negro removal. And they used that policy to steal the rest of the land that they hadn't stolen during the massacre. And the final nail was when they put the Highway 244 directly, squarely in the black community through Greenwood to purposely destroy any opportunity for Greenwood to thrive again. And so this has been the remnants. And right now, if you come to Tulsa, you will see a thriving, beautiful, modern metropolitan city south of I-244, that's white Tulsa, and north of that highway, which is North Tulsa and black, there are no businesses, hardly any businesses. There's no buildings going up. There's no high rises, nothing like that. It's stark as night and day.
Thank you very much. And my next question is for Ms. Heath. So I brought up the massacre in Wilmington. What happened in Tulsa is particularly unique at this 100-year mark because it was an entirely black community. But Wilmington was an example where blacks and whites lived together, and some people just didn't like that. Could you tell us about other instances in our history where we've seen white supremacists intervene in people's thriving multiracial economies?
Thank you. Yes, the U.S. has a history of white supremacists invading black neighborhoods or coalescing among black neighborhoods and, quite frankly, all of a sudden getting sick of some type of economic progress or social progress that creates equitable conditions for black people in those neighborhoods. Red Summer of 1919 is a prime example of dozens of race massacres, also coined as race riots in history, which is a false narrative that does not account for the deliberate and designed destruction of black neighborhoods and their success. So post-Reconstruction, pre-Reconstruction, all the way up to the spirit of what had members of Congress laying on the floor during January 6th is a product of white supremacy in this country.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Ross. Next in order is Mr. Hank Johnson, who has been a leader on this issue in the Congressional Black Caucus and a leader on this issue and others throughout his time in Congress since 2007.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this very important hearing. And I also want to thank the survivors of the massacre who spoke on the first panel and shared their stories with us today. As the 100th year anniversary of the Tulsa Greenwood Massacre approaches, we must examine this part of our history, lest we be bound to repeat it. The massacre of black lives may have been the deadliest, but it certainly was not an isolated event. Black people in this country continue to fight against racist violence even today, and the legacy of racist violence. We cannot let our future be defined by hate any longer and by racism any longer. Later today, I will introduce the Tulsa Greenwood Massacre Accountability Claims Act, which will create a federal cause of action for massacre-related claims. The victims, The victims of this atrocity have been denied justice for far too long. Similar legislation was previously introduced by my friend, former Congressman and former Chairman of the Judiciary Committee, John Conyers. I'm honored to continue his legacy in this way. Ms. Heath, why is congressional action so important to create accountability, and why is accountability so important after atrocities such as Greenwood?
Thank you. As you heard from Mr. Miller and Mr. Solomon Simmons, the courts have failed to deliver justice necessary and hear the merits of these atrocities, and therefore legislative remedy is incredibly important post any serious or gross human rights violation such as the Tulsa Race Massacre, or including acts of racial discrimination, which include housing, education, employment, racial discrimination in the U.S. today impacting Black people. It is incredibly important that repair mechanisms are proportional to the harms that were committed and not just symbolic. In the case of Greenwood, material damage was done, including moral damage, which should be compensated for. And under international law, there are various forms of reparation in addition to financial compensation, legal and institutional reforms also that need to be administered in the case of Greenwood. All forms of repair, given the damage that was done in Greenwood, need to be on the table in order to provide full restitution to the gravity of the harms and crimes committed.
Thank you. Attorney Solomon Simmons, would you care to respond to that question?
Well, again, because this body, this Congress has shown the ability throughout our history with the Japanese internment camp survivors, the 911 Commission. It's important for Congress, the United States of America, to say, you know, what happened to these people were wrong. We have the power to remedy it, and we should remedy it. We must have accountability for what happened in Greenwood. Because if we don't have accountability for what happened in Greenwood, it will only happen again. It's not enough just to know something happened so you won't repeat it. You have to know its consequences that it happened. So far, has been any consequences from anyone at this point, and we're hope and pray that we can get some consequences from Congress.
Thank you. Ms. Heath, are you aware, and Professor Miller, are you all aware of any instances in this country where Black people have received reparation for harm done to them?
Yes, in 1923, the Rosewood Race Massacre occurred 2 years after the Tulsa Race Massacre. Victims in the 1990s were compensated, including their descendants, with scholarships. In addition, North Carolina compensated victims of forced sterilization for a discriminatory eugenics law. So reparations have been paid, but not to descendants of enslaved Africans at the grander level, and also in this case of Tulsa and many other incidents of racial violence.
If we think broadly about reparations, the federal government has actually already made it possible for African Americans, for example, Black farmers, to sue to gain some compensation. So Congress has taken a lead on this before. And
you might need to turn your microphone on, Professor. Was it already on?
Oh, sorry, thought it was on. Did you not hear me?
All right.
So Congress has taken a lead on this before, for example, with the Black farmers legislation, and I'm glad that Congress is taking a lead on it again.
Thank you. So H.R. 40 or the Tulsa Greenwood Massacre Accountability Claims Act would not be new. It would not be unique. It would not be a trailblazer. It would just be a continuation of justice that has been afforded to certain victims of racism in this country throughout our history. Is that correct?
That's correct, and it's worth recognizing that states themselves, California has been a leader in affording this sort of relief to, for example, victims of Armenian genocide, braceros, Holocaust survivors, So it's long overdue for African Americans as well.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Ms. Garcia from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much for bringing this hearing forward. I think it's historic, and just the courage and the tenacity and just the wherewithal of the survivors to be here with us this morning and to share their stories was very, very, very moving and compelling. And I hope that more Americans get to see it. I hope that children get to see it. I hope anyone who studies history see it. So thank you for doing this, and I'm so glad that also you are live streaming this to make sure that people make note. It's a shame, 100 years since the Tulsa Greenwood Race Massacre, and we still find ourselves striving for equal justice under the law for all Americans. You know, Uncle Red said it best. We all need to work together because we are one. We all need to work together because we are one. So it is important that we commemorate the centennial anniversary of this massacre to educate new generations of our country's history, to learn from it and heal from it in order to restore justice for the Greenwood District community as well as many other long-suffering communities alike. That's why I am a co-sponsor of H.R. 398, the resolution. And like President Biden has said, to heal, we must understand. To heal, we must understand. And that's why I also support H.R. 40 and my proud sponsor together with many others here in Congress. And today I've learned of yet another bill that would help restore justice for all, and that's the Accountability Act that Mr. Johnson just mentioned, and I'll certainly sign up to be a sponsor in that bill. And I agree with our nation's top law enforcement official, Attorney General Merrick Garland, that we're obligated to protect each other. That's why highlighting this event 100 years later, when racial hatred drove individuals to carry out unspeakable acts of violence against our own fellow Americans, teaches us about the evils that are perpetuated by white supremacists. Let's be clear, we will not rest until there is justice for all. If you listen to the words of Mother Fletcher, she said that she has lived this massacre every single day, every day. We owe it to her and all the others to make sure that we make change, and we do it now, not later. Hate because of the color of one's skin shall never win. We cannot let it win. America prevails when we come together in peace, and as Uncle Red said, we are one. So I want to begin with you, Attorney Simmons. You know, I noticed in, it may have been your written testimony that groups even like Sinclair Oil loaned them the planes. You know, we hear it, and the chairman asked questions about, you know, the insurance companies. So businesses were involved with this. Have we been able to get a handle on how we can go to the successor businesses? Sinclair Oil, I believe, still exists. Those companies obviously were bought by someone. Have we been able to try to get any damages from them?
Thank you for your question. We are in the process of that. We have reached out to several companies, including Sinclair Oil. They are still around. And then many insurance companies, banks, other publications, and we're trying to hold everyone accountable. And so far, not many people want to talk to us and have a conversation. And that's what we reached out. So let's have a conversation, because these people in Tulsa, my people in Tulsa, we need healing. And you were a part of this 100 years ago, and here's the proof of it.
Right. And I know that I read that there was a commission set up in Oklahoma, and that they did say that reparations should go to the historic Greenwood community in some way, and that it would do much to repair the emotional and physical scars of this terrible incident. Have they done anything? Is there anything that we can do to nudge them, push them,
Well, first of all, they have not done anything. In fact, those same perpetrators of the massacre are now utilizing the massacre to line their own pockets. So, in fact, they haven't done anything. They've done worse. They've actually compounded the trauma, and they've soaked up all of the resources that good people from around the nation that want to support the black people of Tulsa. They don't understand that they're actually supporting the city of Tulsa and the white business owners in Tulsa. That's what's actually happening right now. And I think just this hearing, people understanding the difference, understanding that groups on the ground like the Crutcher Foundation, Justice for Greenwood, the Black Wall Street Legacy Fest, are actually working directly with survivors and descendants, and not the city of Tulsa and the Chamber of Commerce and the state of Oklahoma. They're working for themselves. They're trying to do exactly what they did in 1921 when Tulsa created this slogan called Tulsa Will. Now they have a slogan that says Tulsa Triumphs, to try to say, oh, Tulsa's triumphed over this bad history. The fact is, Tulsa, the city, triumphed over Greenwood. It was Greenwood that was destroyed. It was Greenwood that was looted. And it is Greenwood that needs repair, not Tulsa.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I see my time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Garcia, for your statement and your questions. Ms. Bush, a freshman but experienced and very important member of this committee is from Missouri, is recognized.
St. Louis, and I thank you, Chairman Cohen, for convening this hearing. It is both an honor and a profoundly sobering privilege to be sharing space with you and to Mr. Van Ellis, to Mother Fletcher and Mother Randall, with them as well. I hope to be able to actually meet them. When I go home today, and this is to them, when I go home today, I will call my 7-year-old nephew and tell him about my day. I will tell him that I got to see and hear American heroes today. I will tell him that I spoke to them and all that they lived, all those things that they talked about and how they lived in a neighborhood much like his in St. Louis, that he lives in a neighborhood with local schools just like they did, and favorite parks where he spends his holidays the same way they do, and where he celebrates some of his life's most precious moments the same way that they did. But unlike in his neighborhood in St. Louis, this vibrant, beautiful community in Tulsa was burned down. And yet, Mother Fletcher, Mother Randall, and Mr. Van Ellis are still here with us today, sharing that story of courage. To my colleagues on this committee, there is only one reason why descendants of the Tulsa Massacre have not been compensated, and that reason is racism. It's anti-Black racism, to be clear, and it's been stated a couple times, and I want to state it again. It's anti-Black racism. Racism is not just slavery and Jim Crow. It is the daily violence that is enacted on our communities each and every day we live in this white supremacist society. Racism is when a group of our elders come to our halls to testify about the massacre they survived without any clear commitment from our leaders as to the reparations they are owed. That is outright racism, full stop. What happened in Tulsa on the evening of May 31st and that continued into the day of June 1st, 1921 was a failure of the highest proportions. For 24 hours, the community was under attack, traumatized, brutalized, terrorized, and killed for no other reason than for being Black. It was the failure of our government that helped enable the violent massacre. It was the failure of our leaders for being complicit in white supremacist violence. It was the failure of our country for failing to protect its own citizens. It is a failure only made possible because racism is alive and well in this country. It was alive when a white mob burned Tulsa to a crisp. It is alive now as we debate the merits of repairing harm. Underlying the generational trauma and exploitation is a government that refused to even acknowledge the humanity of our ancestors, enslaved and terrorized under white supremacy. A government that to this day refuses to acknowledge or atone for its own ongoing racism. So let me ask Ms. Goodwin, how has your family, if you could just tell us briefly, how has your family's history been affected by the Tulsa Massacre? And then I have a question for Ms. Crutcher. Ms. Goodwin, how has your family's history been affected by the massacre? If you could name like 3 things that are like really stick out.
Well, one sticks out is the generational wealth that could have been basically accrued by now. There was some $76,244 back in 1921, and today's dollars that has been said to be some 900,000 or perhaps 1.2 million.
My goodness.
So if we just talk about the material loss, that's what you would deal with. If you want to talk about the scars and the, as it's been said over and over again, the ongoing trauma, we feel this every day because we live in this community. And as it's been said, we see a community that's being gentrified. We see a community right now with this massacre is being monetized by Greenwood Rising and all of this hoopla. And the 3 folks that we could do right by right now are still living. And so I can say to you that we feel that, okay?
Yes.
And when you say 3 things, I can name 30 things.
Okay, right? I'm running out of time, but
okay.
Thank you. I'm going to move to Ms. Crutcher. I only have a few seconds left, but could you tell us, what does justice look like to you in your community? Thank you for sharing what you shared for us today, but if you could say what justice is for Tulsa right now, what is that?
Justice is simply restitution, repair, and respect. And those three words. That's what justice looks like.
Thank you. I want to end my remarks by talking directly to all the Black people, the young people who are listening to this discussion today. Know that this country's legacy of racism is still alive today. Our lives, our very existence is a testimony. It's a testament to our will and our strength. It is a testament to our power as a people and how much has stood in our way, in the way of our survival. And yet we are still here. We saw 3 people. They are still here. We are fighting for a world that honors our dignity and our humanity, and know that we will always do this work of liberation and justice for each and every person until it is won. Thank you. Thank you.
That concludes today's hearing, and I'm going to conclude it in the most unusual manner, and then I'm going to advertise a television show. On May the 30th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, a program called Tulsa Burning, the 1921 Race Massacre, will be shown on the History Channel. This is, I think, an important program for those of you who have watched and those who haven't had the opportunity to watch to view. Coincidentally, and just as a Wizards fan, it's produced by Russell Westbrook, but it'll be history. I've learned much today, and I've learned much over the years about the Tulsa Race Massacre, and we need to take action and show that our country understands what Faulkner said. The past is not the past. The past is never dead. We're living now. The past is still with us. I want to thank all our witnesses for appearing today. Without objections, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witness or additional materials for the record. With that, the hearing is adjourned.